Request you all to please put your cell phones on the silent mode. Thank you so much. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session, so please hold on to your questions. We would now like to also let you know that Aarathi Prasad would be doing a book signing at the end of the event. So if any of you all want to get the book signed, please meet her outside in the book signing tent. The name of our session today is Traditions of Healing, Travels to Indian Medicine. We have Aarathi Prasad introduced by Bhrigupati Singh. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. It's my great privilege to introduce to you Aarathi Prasad, who continues the fundamental task that my own discipline of cultural anthropology had set itself, which is to translate between different cultures and knowledge systems. Aarathi is from a distinctly post-colonial heritage, what we might think of as Midnight's grandchildren, in a way that is quite significant for the book and that we'll also discuss. She was born in London to an Indian mother and a Trinidadian father and was educated in the West Indies and the UK. She has a PhD in molecular genetics from Imperial College London and has since sort of been both within and much beyond academia, pursuing a very exciting trajectory across research, writing, science policy, and media and communications. Her writings on science and what we sort of might call the realm of emerging futures have appeared in publications including The Guardian, The Telegraph, Vogue, and Wired UK. She's written and presented TV and radio programs, including Quest for Virgin Birth on BBC Radio 4, Channel 4's controversial Is It Better to Be Mixed Race, and The Science of the Future with Stephen Hawking for the Discovery Channel and National Geographic. Aarathi has been a science advisor to the British Council. She's worked in science policy in areas including the passage in the UK Parliament of the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act 2008, and she's been a recipient of the Wellcome Trust Mentoring Award for Emerging Talent. She's currently based at University College London. Her first book, Like a Virgin, How Science is Redesigning the Rules of Sex, was published in UK in August 2012. Today, we'll be discussing her second book, In the Bone Setter's Waiting Room, Travels Through Indian Medicine, published just a few months ago. So in just a couple of minutes, I'll turn the mic over to Aarathi and ask her to introduce the book to you. But before I do that, I wanted to just flag 2 or 3 points that I have found to be really striking and original and think this is a very important book at many levels. The first, most crucially, this is a book literally about life and death. The fundamental or central issue of the book is the fate of diverse forms of healthcare in contemporary India. As Aarathi tells us, there are officially 7 recognized forms of healthcare in India. But within this diversity, there is a kind of catastrophe or multiple catastrophes of healthcare, which Aarathi outlines for us in India in ways that are shocking even for people who are interested in these issues, or if you're not, then this is a book that is quite eye-opening, and my own first question will be around that, around the kind of both the tension between catastrophe and creativity in this book. The second very important thing that this book does is that I don't think anyone should come to this book thinking that this is about traditional medicine in the sense that here's West and here's East. It arrives at very interesting kind of hybrids of what are the kinds of concerns facing Ayurvedic practitioners today. What does innovation in neuroscience look like outside the bounds of the laboratory? And inhabits a terrain of a very kind of a pluralist terrain of an intensely hybrid variety. So that's something that's very important that this book achieves. Aarthi's travels in this book, we might think of it as a new kind of travel writing, which takes us not through spaces, but through very different kinds of knowledge systems. She takes us through bone setters clinics here in Jaipur, in Hyderabad, into the waiting rooms of Bollywood plastic surgeons, to Ayurvedic healers and asthma treatment cures that involve swallowing a live fish, to mental health initiatives in Dharavi's slums, in famous Dharavi slum of Mumbai, to Gond tribal villages in Maharashtra in the midst of Naxalite territory, and to innovations in neuroscience happening in Old Delhi. Aarti's book points us to a very different kind of picture of the contemporary and of a density of healing practices that is specific to South Asia but also beyond, and allows us to think about the present and the future of health in a different way, I hope. And it remains to be seen. We'll discuss whether it's an optimistic book or deeply alerts us to a kind of catastrophe that we are living, or more importantly, that the poor in particular face. So all of those are the things I very much look forward to discussing. Just to say one line about what I'm doing here and who I am. I'm Bhrigu, and I teach anthropology at Brown University. My own first book, which I just discussed in a panel a couple of days ago, is called Poverty and the Quest for Life, and it's set in rural Rajasthan, and among other things, thinks about conceptions of vitality and well-being. But more sort of closer to this terrain, the last 1 year I spent on a research sabbatical at AIIMS, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, which many of you will have heard of, in the Department of Psychiatry. And in the course of studying mental health, realized quite quickly how important and central shrines and dargahs continue to be, particularly for mental health, but even beyond that. And that's something we are hopefully going to discuss, because it's also a crucial part of Aarti's thought process. So with that, and this kind of shared uncertainty that we both have about the lines between the past and the future, I look forward to learning more from Aarti and to hearing her introduce this very remarkable and very important book. Thank you. Over to Aarti.
Thank you, Bhrigu. So a few years ago, the Wellcome Trust, it's a medical research charity in England, and it also so it funds nearly as much medical research as the British government does. But they also have a very interesting creative approach to science and medicine. So they run events that engage the general public, like art exhibitions and books and documentaries. So a few years ago, they said to me that they were arranging an exhibition in India on street medicine. And the head of engagement said, it occurred to me, would you like to write a book about Indian medicine? And I said, what's that? Because, I mean, do you mean indigenous? Do you mean, is there such a thing as indigenous? And he said, I don't know. So I went away and decided to look across the spectrum. And I knew that in the 1 year that I had to write the book, I couldn't possibly cover everything. But I wanted really to represent India as it is. It's a place of great contrast, with many multiplicities and juxtapositions. And so I made the decision to look at people across different socioeconomic backgrounds, rural and urban, faith healing to high tech. And that's how the chapters came about. Some of them look at traditional and faith healing, juxtaposed with the modern provision of medicine. So you mentioned healing shrines, and in the first chapter, I visit the slum in Aarathi in Mumbai, which is a very interesting place. If you haven't been, I would recommend it. My daughter and I went in the monsoon, so it was absolutely flooded. There was sewage everywhere, and it was very hard to navigate it. But the reason I went there is to visit a hospital called Chota Sayan, which is the only hospital inside of the slum. As you can imagine, not many doctors and medical professionals want to go there, and even though it's in an urban center. And I was particularly interested in a project that looked at gender-based violence. I wanted to look at mental health provision, and so I went to visit this charity that was based in this hospital. When I got there, I realized that there was also a shrine in the courtyard of the hospital. I said to Nereen, who runs this charity called Sneha, Society for Nutrition and Education Action, that I wanted to visit Sufi shrines, and I didn't get a chance to. And what I was interested about Sufi shrines is that, or shrine healing and faith healing, was that people could equally go and pray or visit a shrine or visit a Baba and go to a medical doctor and access psychiatric medicine. And I've seen this several times in the book. There's no not necessarily a contradiction between the idea that I'm going to access something for which there is no evidence and something for which there is some. And one of the questions I had in my mind is evidence important at all? How important is it in accessing medical treatment? So I went to this hospital and I said to Nerine, the director there, I wanted to see a Sufi shrine, but I'm not going to have time. She said, oh, but there's a shrine in our courtyard. I said, what, is it like a hospital chapel? Because in England, most hospitals have a chaplain where you can go and pray whatever religion you are. And she said, yes, yeah, it was built for the hospital. But when I looked into it, I found that it wasn't built for the hospital. In fact, the hospital had been built around it. It was built around the image of a goddess, a stone idol of a goddess that was found on the land some centuries ago. And it was currently run by a priestess. And this priestess was an oracle. So people would go and ask her questions. And she tended to attract women who'd been in abusive marriages, who were subjects of domestic violence, which is, by the way, probably practically all the women in the slum. It's something that's so prevalent, and it's something that's so culturally ingrained that Nerine started this gender-based violence project because a pediatrician, obstetrician she worked with saw women coming in from the slum, treated them and they'd go away, but she noticed bruises on them. She started asking the doctors, every time you see this, come and report it to me. And they quickly realized this was a big problem. And I say culturally it was a problem because initially the women didn't recognize it as a problem. They said, oh, if you want to help us, give us some money for my daughter's wedding instead. They said, he did beat me, but it was okay because I didn't put enough salt in the food. So changing those cultural attitudes was really important. So these women would traditionally go to the oracle called Sabawa, and they'd offer bangles or chickens or goats. There's a ceremony in June where many goats are sacrificed and their hospital shrine turns into a bloodbath. And the shrine sits in the entrance to the hospital. So they walk past the shrine and into the hospital to get both treatments. So what I realized in Dharavi and what Nerine told me was that people try everything there. Dharavi as a slum is a kind of microcosm of the whole of India. People come from all parts of the country with all their religions and beliefs, and people freely pick and choose from that. So there are untrained Ayurvedic doctors, there are faith healers, there is this oracle, there are bone setters in the slum, street dentists, you name it. One of the people she works with is a guy called Sitaram, and I want to tell you his story because he grew up in the slum. He came from a rural area, and he converted to Christianity. So when I met Nerine, she said, you should speak to Sitaram, and said that his wife had been to a Christian faith healing. And I said, but Sitaram's a Hindu name. She said, you ask him. So I'm just going to tell you this story. There was the story of one of Nerine's colleagues, Sitaram, and the exorcism performed on his wife after a 7-day prayer session in the local Presbyterian church. But Sitaram's a Hindu name, I said, confused. Nerine smiled. No one can explain how his wife got better. There must be an explanation, but it seems like a miracle. She was severely ill. You should ask him about it. When I found Sitaram, he was at an art center that Nerine and colleagues had set up. Finding space for an art gallery in Dharavi had been a costly challenge, but inside Colorbox, the work of local women was being arranged for the Dharavi Biennale, the world's only biennale hosted in a slum. The art they had made, textiles, furniture, paintings with themes of family, marital discord, rape, dreams of homes that were safe and salubrious for their children, functioned as therapy, as well as developing vocational skills and for earning an income for the artists. The facade of the narrow rented building, which had once been crumbling plaster and exposed brick, had already been painted with the project's colorful logo, a quadrant containing a heart, an eye, a cross, and the symbol of infinity, symbolizing health, art, and recycling. like tarpaulins from luxury apartment bills. This is what, in the monsoon, people cover their slum dwellings with. In Dharavi, everything becomes something else. Outside Colour Box, Sitaram greeted me joyfully, chatting as we walked back to Chota Sayan, the hospital, and periodically shielding me from the chaotic rush of vehicles, which paid pedestrians no heed. He was the kind of person anyone would take an instant liking to, friendly, funny, with a delightful grin that lifted up his neat moustache when it appeared. As he negotiated the fainting umbrellas and found us footholds along the main road, which was rapidly filling with water, he told me how his wife, who had been diagnosed with multi-drug resistant tuberculosis and given months to live, had woken up one morning speaking in tongues, specifically in Tamil, a South Indian language that she had no previous knowledge of or exposure to. Sitaram had been born into a Hindu family from rural Maharashtra, raised in Dharavi, and later became a convert to Christianity. Much as the patients who saw no conflict in making offerings at the oracle's shrine en route to accessing modern medicine for the problems that ailed them, Sitaram seemed to be relating a similar underlying narrative in which, in seeking a cure, the lines between the spiritual and the physical were blurred. When doctors were unable to effectively treat his wife's tuberculosis, she both continued the drug treatment and turned to the Christian church, and later a Hindu temple, in the hope of being healed. Though bearing parallels to Devi possession, speaking in tongues seemed like a particularly Christian phenomenon, for which Sitaram naturally turned to a Dharavi church. We are from a village in Maharashtra. Varsha, my wife, spoke only Marathi, Sitaram told me. So how did you end up at the church? Is your family Christian? I asked. My family all converted. I did too. I was happy to. He smiled his jolly smile. I like Jesus. We took my wife to the church, and the priests sat in a circle around her and prayed. She kept talking in Tamil, but after 7 days, she stopped. She was healed. And what about the tuberculosis? I asked. For that, there was nothing we can do. Her lungs seemed entirely damaged. The medicines were not working. I sent her back to the village for a while with the children. I had to work, but I thought she would be much more relaxed there. It is less stressful, you see. I nodded. In the village, she was taken to the temple. The Devi is worshipped there. She was the goddess we prayed to before. In the temple, the villagers said prayers for her. Then the goddess spoke to one of the village women, and she told us, your family has left your own gods, your own beliefs. Come back to the goddess, and whatever is inside your wife will leave her. Varsha stayed in the temple. There they prayed over her, and one day her hair suddenly became wild like the goddess's. They told me the goddess had entered her, and when she went back to normal, after prayers had finished, she was better. The tuberculosis had gone. As we arrived at the gates to Chota Sayan Hospital, I found myself partly attempting to calculate the probability of recovery from an advanced state of lung damage, and partly getting used to the divine modus operandi that Dharavi's residents seemed perfectly at ease with.
I'm wondering would you share one more excerpt so spiritual healing is certainly something we were put together to discuss that, and we certainly will. But maybe an excerpt also on the centrality of how you're thinking about Ayurveda in this. So maybe we can share one more excerpt from one of those portions of the book where you're directly discussing, if there is an excerpt you'd like to share.
There is. But I also, what I experienced there in Dharavi, I saw again in Hyderabad. So a few months later, and I had to wait to go to Hyderabad because I wanted to see the fish swallowing events, which is massive. They were preparing for about 50,000 people to come. So what happens is, they're not doctors, they're completely untrained. But in the late 19th century, one of the ancestors was a very charitable man, and a holy man came up to him and said, if you use water from this well, I'll give you the secret formulation for herbs, and you'll be able to heal people. But you must never tell them what's in the herbs, and you must never charge money for it. And if you do, it'll stop working. So this tradition has continued, and it's been growing and growing and growing to the point where they have tens of thousands of people coming. It's recognized by the Hyderabad state government, Telangana now. And it involves making a herbal paste, which looks like a yellow herbal paste. They get a small fish that's about the size of your finger. They stuff the paste into the mouth of the fish, and you swallow the fish. So they tend to hold your nose so you don't shut. It's quite horrific. Little children do it, adults, everyone comes. By the way, the same thing that happens in the shrine, this might be a Hindu shrine, and these Hyderabad doctors may be Hindu, but Christians come, Muslims come, everybody comes and participates in this. And so you swallow the fish, and it only happens once a year. It happens once a year in June at a particular time when the constellations are aligned. And so I had to wait an entire year to go there. So when I got there, I went to their house, the House of the Healers, and I encountered the same thing. For example, one of the girls I met was from Delhi. One of the patients was waiting in the line. I went to speak to them, thousands of people there. And I went to her because she was wearing jeans and she looked very modern and I talked to her, and she was very well educated. She was a psychologist. She'd studied psychology. And I said, what's the deal here? And she said, well, I have asthma. I got it a few years ago. So this treatment is particularly for asthma. She said, oh, my friends in Delhi, they think this is, she said a bad word, they think this is absolute rubbish. But I come here anyway. She said, but I come with my asthma inhaler in my pocket. So again, it's the kind of use of both. So I was looking at that sort of apparent contradiction and asking whether it was a contradiction at all. But the other two, so as you said, one of the reasons I asked the guy at the welcome, what do you mean by Indian medicine, is because this country has quite a unique pluralistic system of medicine, whereby it's called Ayush, which incorporates several things, including the Tibetan Sarigpa. I'm not going to talk about homeopathy or naturopathy, which are European in origin, and are, I think, without evidence base completely. But in terms of the other two, which were originally being considered in 1947 when India became independent, is Unani and Ayurveda. And Unani and Ayurveda and Sarigpa and a lot of the folk herbal traditions are grounded in Ayurveda. So in 1947, when the first government formed, they had the concern, as we have today, of how to provide health for all. And one of the ideas was to integrate the medicine that was being practiced before the British banned it in 1835 or 1840 or so, or whether they should maintain the British system of medicine. And so a committee called the Chopra Committee was formed to interrogate this question. And their conclusion was, yes, we should integrate both systems because this is the best way of providing healthcare for everyone while respecting our traditions, etc. And they thought it was possible by studying Ayurveda in the way that modern medicine had the opportunity to be studied over the last 200 years in a way that Ayurveda did not have the ability to be because it was banned as medicine. So you could study it as Indology or as history, but not as medicine. And they thought it would work. They presented it to the interim government in 1947, and the government said, no, we don't think this will work because the basis of Western medicine and Ayurveda is so different that we can't see it working together. So one of the questions I had is, where are we today? Where are we today? It took 50 years for India to create a department of Ayush. So at the moment there are about 400 MBBS, so normal medical, Western medical schools in India, and there are 500 Ayush medical colleges where people study or Ayurveda or Unani, but also biomedical subjects, your biochemistry, your genetics, microbiology, all the rest of it, so that they have a knowledge of both. So it took decades for us to get to this stage. There are many people in India pushing for an integration. we can talk about the Chinese model you mentioned
absolutely.
as well.
So maybe one of the things I thought that we might share with our listeners is also there's sort of two kinds of non-fiction books that one often sees. One is about this sort of the poor. There's one genre book which says how much innovation there is, or Indians know jugaad, or are very creative. And then there's one genre book which is sort of doomsaying and catastrophe. And this book does a very kind of interesting fluctuation of a sort between light and dark. And I wanted to ask you to say a little more before we get to some of the other issues about the centrality of inequality in this book. And I just wanted to share as the sort of overall context, two forms of kind of what we might think of as catastrophe that this book alerts us to. One is sort of the overall context of healthcare in India. And the second is what is the place of integrative medicine, as it's called. So just to come to healthcare, in some of the key and quite startling facts that Aarathi outlines for us in the book, on average, countries spend 6% of the GDP of their GDP on health provisions. India spends roughly 1%. It actually went down the figure in the 2014-2015 budget. India's free healthcare is worse than Afghanistan, as Aarathi tells us. India is also the world's largest exporter of doctors to the US and the UK. Illness, as Aarathi says, is the most common cause of sort of spirals of indebtedness among the poor. And according to 2013 statistics, there are 72 suicides daily by those with illness for which they couldn't afford any kind of help. So within that kind of a context of a kind of darkness and real puzzling, I mean, 1% of the budget is one of the lowest in the world. And yet, kind of, the book is sort of, if you just encounter it as a lay reader or Google it, it's pitched sort of as a book about creativity and hope. But in reading the book, you get this kind of real sense of this movement between hope and despair. So the first, I guess, I'm wondering whether you think of this as a hopeful book, or how does one understand this movement between creativity and catastrophe that your book is alerting us to? Is it a hopeful book, or is it?
I think it is hopeful. I mean, I end with one of the, what you see happening, because such a low percentage of GDP is invested into healthcare, and people don't have access to free healthcare. I mean, it's not a universal situation, and people are plunged into debt. And I don't just mean below poverty line people, I mean middle class people.
Absolutely, yeah.
And people are selling property to access healthcare. It's setting up a very vicious cycle, especially if you think that there are infectious diseases, but also look at the trajectory of the chronic diseases in India, the diabetes, the heart disease, the obesity, other conditions that you are going to live for a long time with. That's not going to kill you, but you're going to suffer and become debilitated. Then it sets up a very bad situation. And so what I found is, so the government's putting very little in, and it varies by state, so some states are much, much better than others. But what you have in that are people that are filling the gap, there are philanthropists who are doing that, which is what happened in Britain, many years ago also. There are people who are putting their own money in and who are creating these innovative projects to provide healthcare to those who need it the most. And there is hope that they will be able to, despite bureaucracy, whatever else there is, that they will be able to create strong models for change, and that those will be adopted. So I wanted to go back to.
But the other thing I wanted to actually also flag, if we can do that in the sort of darker reading of the book, is the sort of tragedy of integrative medicine in a way. The thing we were discussing, that it's quite striking that if one goes to a hospital, I mean, in other parts of Asia, for example, China, if you go to a hospital in China, typically you would, in any hospital, meet a biomedically trained specialist, Western biomedicine. You would meet what is called TCM, a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, together, and they would design some kind of a regimen for you together in terms of sort of emergency and maintenance, and a combination of things that figure within TCM. this, if we take, and this for me personally was the single most impressive thing, I'm much more impressive than China's so-called economic might and stuff, is this. So if one thinks about the contrast with India, it's quite striking, and people have tried to understand where exactly this disjuncture emerged, that there's absolutely the synthesis, they're like flickerings or glimmerings of it, but there's really nothing at all of any kind of a conversation or any kind of a synthesis systematically. So how did that happen? Aarti gives us a sort of a very interesting history of how that happened, and I think that's also something that we might flag. There's a kind of movement, she begins in the 15th century with this Portuguese doctor who comes and has a 30-year-long medical practice in Goa, Garcia de Horta, in the 16th century, and spends 30 years investigating a kind of, creating a kind of what is integrative medicine. And the really striking intervention, or the sort of tragic intervention of Macaulay, who is always an important figure when one is thinking about education in India, but the striking intervention of Macaulay, until there's a kind of history that moves to the Chopra Committee, which tries to understand how health may or may not be integrated, and crucially, Aarti's grandfather was the secretary of this very historic Chopra Committee, which tried to suggest ways in which this integration ought to happen, and it was turned down by the government, as Aarti tells us. So there's a kind of very interesting history you give us of why this really sharp contrast exists between India and other parts of Asia. So I'm wondering whether there's anything comparative that you have come away with from this, in the sense that is there things India might learn from other parts of the world? How has this history been very so specific related to colonialism?
Well, I think, I mean, as you mentioned, the history very quickly is when the Portuguese came in, because what happened was Europeans were coming here, they had to talk to Indian doctors because they'd never encountered diseases, tropical diseases, so they became the kind of pioneers, I guess, of tropical medicine in the West. And they learnt about plants here and medical treatments that they took back. So in terms of Portugal, they took it back from, in Goa in the 16th century, there was in the world's first integrated medical hospital. They took that knowledge back to Coimbra and Lisbon and used it in hospitals there. So that was all going along nicely. They were integrated medical schools in India until Macaulay, and then that was stopped, and then British kind of Western medicine became the dominant form. And then, as
Absolutely,
I said,
and that passages you have on Calcutta Medical College are also quite striking.
Yeah. Considering that India has a long history of excellent medicine, conversation with the outside world, so from ancient Greece to the Syrian Caliphate, where they were talking about surgery as detailed in the Sushruta Samhita, and then it was all stopped, and then in Calcutta they claimed that there was never human dissection before, and clearly there had been. But yeah, and then it took 50 years or so, several decades, before there was a Department of Ayush looking at traditional systems, but also the potential for integration. Now what I found is both in Unani and Ayurveda, the government is funding something that's, I think, quite interesting, because it's at the interface of the way that science and scientific research is conducted and what Ayurveda has and Unani have to offer. So there are these research institutes set up where they're looking at Ayurvedic and Unani formulations, and a lot of the people who work there are actually biochemical scientists or geneticists trained in the Western scientific method, who are studying those.
And like the emerging field of Ayurgenomics.
Yeah, I don't know what I think of that, but basically there are a growing number of integrated hospitals. So I went to Bangalore to visit one, which was set up by a person called Darshan Shankar, and it is called a Foundation for the Revitalization of Traditional Systems of Medicine. And they, on the site, have an integrated hospital where there are Ayurvedic and Unani doctors, but there are also MBBS doctors, and they have PAF labs and everything you'd expect in a normal hospital. And so people have access to both. But what I asked him, and I'll read it to you, which I think is quite interesting, is why is it important now that this happens? Why should we be why does he think we should be going more the way of China and less in terms of separating both? Now remember, integration gets criticized from all angles, right? It gets criticized by your traditional Ayurvedic practitioners and by Western doctors, because the traditional system of Ayurvedic training is very different from modern training. So it's a Gurukula system where you stay there for many, many years and you meditate and you learn to read the Sanskrit texts and you do a whole host of, and you learn the plants very well. In modern Ayush colleges, you are doing a 3 or 4 year degree where you do other subjects as well. And so your grounding isn't as strong. So, but remember in the old system, doctors only came from a certain caste and they were only men. And it was a very long period of training that required patronage from a royal family or a wealthy. So it wasn't sort of a system that was democratized. So, there are pros and cons. But I asked him why this was important. So he said, the pluralistic system in India. Pluralistic choices have set the stage for people to ask questions and take different options, which no one system has the answers. But, he continued, educational and healthcare institutes have not caught up. 40 to 70% of people are exercising that choice. The World Health Organization report on the use of traditional medicine shows that. I'm not talking about practitioners, but for the public, sometimes they're well informed, sometimes they are not. So sometimes there will be good outcomes, sometimes not. In a nutshell, today, for whatever political and sociological reasons, Western knowledge systems are dominant in all parts of the world. So you have a system prevailing in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, America, everywhere. Western traditions dominate. Its strength is that Western science has incredible knowledge of detail, the fundamental units of the physical world, but you don't have a picture of the whole. I was interested, continue here. Yeah, see, he said, it costs millions of US dollars to do biomedical research, but Ayurveda has survived for centuries and was created by a long history, not by science. There are 5,000 medical manuscripts in Siddha. There are 100,000 in Ayurveda, covering all aspects of medicine and surgery. It's highly, highly sophisticated. What Ayurveda needs to progress is to use modern tools. So the way we are working now is like this. The theory will be Ayurveda, the tools will be modern. And traditional theory must also grow in parallel, otherwise it will lose autonomy. If Ayurveda wants to come out of its marginalization, today I have no option but to talk to the dominant medical system. In future, in this age, we should be able to use modern methods to detect kapha, vata, pitta doshas on a cellular level. I left to talk to some of Darshan Shankar's research scientists, visit their botanical gardens, and investigate the thriving integrated medical hospital across the way. I thought on the short walk over about the point Darshan had made and what this would mean for the future of Ayurveda in India. In order to compete with the dominant allopathic system, as he believes it is necessary to do, India's traditional systems require a different level of understanding and the development of new characteristics. While knowledge of its foundations will remain necessary, new applications of Ayurvedic medicine must see what changes are occurring on a cellular level, just as scientific medicine is doing. I was also very clear on what he thought the benefits of integration were. It is important to revitalize traditional medicine because of the marginalization of traditional knowledge, he told me, for 3 reasons. 1, because depressed traditional communities will get visibility, because patients will benefit, and because the frontiers of knowledge will expand.
Thank you. If we could maybe hold this thought and bring it a step further on what integration is or where the disjunctures may arise, then I think it's no accident, or I didn't mean it just as a joke or as a flippant remark to call us or Aarathi Midnight's grandchildren, because she's quite literally continuing a task that her maternal grandfather had begun. And part of that task, sort of post-colonial, is to rethink where the lines of what is acceptable in a way, or how one understands other systems of knowledge and the degree of otherness one is willing to go tell. So it's one thing, Ayurveda is a system of knowledge, reasonably understandable logically, but it's quite another thing to visit, say, an oracle or to go to a Sufi shrine and think of that as a legitimate as having efficacy, say, in the domain of mental health. So I'm wondering if we could chat a little bit more about the two of us, and maybe I can add a thought or two as well. Aarti has a very interesting term she uses just once in passing called my quackery radar. My quackery radar went up. And remember that Aarti is a PhD in molecular genetics from the most prestigious place to study science in the UK. So if we could discuss your quackery radar a little bit, it's quite interesting that, so the chapter on swallowing a live fish as a cure for asthma, 50,000 people come to that in Sikandrabad. The chapter begins with Aarti saying, when I heard swallowing a live fish as a cure for asthma, my quackery radar went up. By the end of the chapter, you can see that Aarti is quite sympathetic to the treatment and is actually, after speaking to Shreya and others, the characters who appear in this chapter, by the end of the chapter, she is willing to hold in abeyance any kind of doubt, in a way. Similarly, on the Chota Sion chapter, Depressed in Dharavi, the opening chapter of her book, in the hospital, there's a psychologist working on the second floor, working with women and domestic violence and mental health, perfectly understandable. In the courtyard, there's a mother goddess oracle. You keep expecting as you read the chapter that now Aarti is going to turn against the oracle and say that this is just nonsense, and actually it's domestic violence is what is at stake. But she holds both together without necessarily committing to a view on either as having necessarily more efficacy, although you can see she's more drawn to thinking about domestic violence. But I'll add a thought as well, but maybe if you could say where your quackery radar stops or begins, and as a geneticist or as a person trained in sort of what people would call the hard sciences, where you feel the threshold of what you're willing to, how low or high your radar might be, and then maybe my radar may differ from yours, so I'll say a little bit about that.
Yeah, please. I mean, I don't, I'm not sure what I think of aerogenomics, because what that is, so I told you that they have this amazing database in Bangalore of plants, formulations from the Ayurvedic tradition, which they can map on to Unani or Sarigpa or any other herbal therapies that runs from 1500 BC till 1900 something, right? And then they're using chemical and genetic analysis on the plants, which I completely, that's great. You know, they're trying to see what the active ingredients are. But aerogenomics is looking at the doshas, so the humors, which are concepts that don't naturally match with modern science, and trying to look at the genetic, the genome and how variation, like if I'm Vata and you sequence my genome, what variations in my genome. Now the thing about genetics is, with my geneticist hat on, the diseases we experience are a combination of our environment as well as our genes, and they may appear or not appear. And so, but that's something I'm not sure about. The thing about the proper, like what you'd think are proper quacks, so someone tells you that you can swallow a fish and and your asthma will stop, or what this oracle is doing. I had some thoughts on, because I feel like what people are saying repeatedly, and what one of the key differences I think is between Western medicine and Asian systems of medicine, what's quite key is that there is a non-separation between the body and the mind, and the body and mind and environment in Asian systems. You can't. That's what he's saying about taking it as a whole, whereas the common accusation of Western science is it's very reductionist, so you're looking at small parts. What's happening in the national health system in England at the moment as well is they're trying to look more at social and psychological and environmental causes of disease. So in a way, we're trying to go towards more of an Asian tradition, because what this oracle is doing in the temple and what the fish doctors are doing is not just, and this is what faith healers, traditional healers are quite good at, is not just looking at the particular illness you go to the doctor with, but understanding the social, cultural, historical context that you're coming with that problem, that you're coming to them with that problem. They may know your family, they may know your grandparents and your grandchildren, and so they may know what's happening at home, and are able to contextualize your physical illness with what's happening in that environment. And so I think there are key themes where, with the fish doctors, there are people in, I was saying before, there are people in every tradition of medicine who are quacks, and there's no doubt about it. So there will be people who are giving antibiotics or injections or whatever Western pharmacological products who don't know what they're doing. There are faith healers in tribal villages who will brand you with irons, which is, for ghost possession. But then there are people like the fish doctors. I wasn't sure because I don't know what's in their formulation, but they are using herbs, and I had some ideas. But plants have chemical ingredients, and they're doing something. I don't think it's safe that you're taking something that you don't know what's in it, because drugs can react against each other. But when I left the fish doctors, I had a kind of conclusion, a kind of synthesis of what I thought. And that's, so I wrote, in India, a country that had recently launched a Mars mission, albeit on a day thought to be auspicious to the red planet, a medical treatment, this is the fish treatment, a medical treatment with no known evidence base, show no signs of being relegated to the past. On the contrary, there was a medieval fervor here. It had originated with a holy man and involved a spiritual blessing. I was sure that next June, the crowds would multiply even further. For any patient to be really to be able to make an informed decision about health choices on offer, you could argue that it is important to understand whether, and if so, how such medicines actually worked. Treatment should also be given in line with a diagnosis, whereas in this case, patients turned up to take medication for a disease they say they had. There are no checks in place to ascertain whether what they believe to be true actually is. If it isn't true, then what unknown conditions are going undiagnosed under the cover of asthma-like symptoms? What really is the origin of their coughs? Still, here was a treatment that resonated with the psyche of a deep-seated tradition in which, in the pursuit of well-being, there can be no real separation of body and mind. It incorporated diet and lifestyle. It was said to have no side effects. It was offered with no expectation of payment or gain from medical staff. It engendered trust. It struck me that in developing healthcare for India, and indeed any nation, it would be wise not to overlook any of these factors.
Very interesting. Well, before we'll soon shift to Q&A and it'll be as interesting to hear what people have to say and to ask us. But I think it's also an important thing in this to think about what constitutes evidence and how far one can go into what I'm saying are degrees of otherness in a way, into other forms of knowledge, in which there are certain fundamentally quite different systems, and how one understands each of those. And seemingly even the most bizarre, I mean, I can happily say that the chapter that sort of you wanted to do but didn't get time to do, the Sufi shrine chapter, that's something that has been very close to my own work in the last 1 year. And in Indian medicine, for example, Indian psychiatry has been, the Indian Journal of Psychiatry was founded in 1949, and continuously almost has been interested in this issue of what happens outside of the realm of psychiatry, including in the realm of what kind of evidence one can find. So NIMHANS, which is sort of the leading place for research, did a very interesting study in a shrine, a Muthuswami temple in Tamil Nadu, and basically followed a cohort of patients over a period of 3 months. And if you are, from a clinical perspective, sort of you measure psychiatric through their different scales for depression, for schizophrenia, etc. And by those scales, they showed that over a 3-month period, this particular cohort of patients had significantly improved according to sort of this rating scales that psychiatrists themselves have. How one would conceptualize this, or what kind of a therapeutic form this is actually a very difficult question. But medical practitioners themselves, at least in the case of psychiatry, for example, have been deeply interested in what goes on outside of the realm of official biomedicine. And this last thing I'll say is that it's not sort of, for those people who care about numbers, it's not a small or side plot. So just to give you one parting example, the Sufi shrine I visited with a small team of psychiatrists from AIMS, and then visited it many times and sort of will probably write about it, is the Sufi shrine of Badaयूं in UP, which is sort of considered the supreme court for mental health, because often shrines, people joke, are organized like multi-speciality hospitals, that there's a particular speciality a shrine will have, so you go to it for that particular thing. So Badaयूं is the most famous place among 3 major shrines or Sufi network for mental health issues. And on any given day, there are about 60,000 treatment seekers in Badaयूं, which is roughly twice or thrice the number of all, if you were to add every bed available for a patient, every mental health institution in the country, if it was packed to full capacity, it would still only have 1/3 of what the number of treatment seekers that are there on any given day in Badaयूं. So numerically also, for the more sort of empirically public health minded people, these issues are not sort of just small or side plot or alternative. For many people, this is the mainstream. This is the main thing they do, without necessarily saying that this is the only thing they have recourse to, because as Aarathi is showing us very nicely, people are trying out a multiplicity of systems for good and for ill. So
one of the things I think needs to be mentioned, and I don't know, I just have a maybe anecdotal sense of this, is who these people are. Who are these people who are going to, people who might be quacks or not, and why are they feeling compelled to do it?
I mean, as an anthropologist, you also do sort of, in any research thing, demographic and caste, and you follow where the people are coming from. So what is remarkable, even in a place like, one of the reasons I was drawn to AIMS, for example, is one of the last democratic medical institutions in the country, in the sense of, from the rich, people joke that from the beggar to the prime minister, you can find anyone getting treatment at AIMS. But you can also pretty much be certain that everyone from the beggar to the prime minister will also be doing something else alongside that, may be shrine-based or spiritual. So I don't think it's only the poor who are trying this sort of multiplicity of systems. A place like Badaयूं attracts, as we know, I mean, Hindus, Muslims, middle class, lower middle class, and a huge number of the poor people are the poorest of the poor. But it isn't in any way the case that this is something only the poor do.
No, but I think there are 2 points additionally. And one is aspirational, what people aspire to using.
Absolutely.
And the other is reorientalization. So what do you find? Because I asked people I encountered, from manual laborers, ladies with ripped saris and bricks on their heads, to auto drivers, to taxi drivers, do you use Ayurveda? What do you use? And they said, no, we go to the clinic. What clinic do you go to? Well, there are many, but we choose the one that we can afford. Western medicine, madam, that's what
Actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's some of the more almost humorous, where Aarti is writing about, for example, L'Oreal's interest in Ayurveda, or what she calls the reorientalization.
Is one of the doctors in integrated hospital said to me, there's no doubt that when we see Ayurveda and things becoming more fashionable in the West, more people are asking for it. And the people who are asking for it are middle classes or people who are well off. So it's the spas, it's the lifestyle choice, the leisure choice. And one of the questions I had in the beginning is, in the pluralistic system, it sounds like you have an awful lot of choice, but do you? Is that choice predicated on what income background you come from?
Absolutely, that's a very, very important question. There are people from social science and anthropology who've written about what they call forced pluralism, which is that actually it is a lack of choice, and you go from system to system getting sort of wrong diagnosis or inadequate care, or you have a chronic disease misidentified as something else. So it's quite terrifying, the way in which people have shown you what are called pathways studies in medicine.
So for the people who have money and are able to pay for it, India has some of the best hospitals in the world. But for the people who can't, this is why you get massive crowds like the 50,000 people in Hyderabad coming to swallow fish. You've got, for some of them, they have to be fairly desperate to not, this is a free treatment, so go try it. And so I just wanted to say this last thing about social inequality and how it relates to health, and how we, if you don't have access to safe, good, free healthcare, then that's putting you at an immediate disadvantage. But again, the idea that universal healthcare that we have in Britain is still not enough, because we still have great social inequity. So in University College London, where I'm based, I have a research assistant who is a PhD student. She's from Delhi, called Ina Goel, and she's studying Hijra communities in Delhi. And she was just telling me the other day that you can recognize Hijra as third gender, but what do
we
you...
have to...
I'll just finish my sentence. Oh, okay. Should I finish my sentence?
Yes.
It's a question of when you go to a hospital, where do you queue up in the line for the men or the women? Do you feel like you're being accepted? If you are below the poverty line, do you feel comfortable in that environment enough to go in? So that both the availability of medicines, but also the ideas of social exclusion that need to be considered.
Sorry, my sincere apologies I've been quite cavalier in keeping time, but I thought we had until 11:15, but no, we have only until 11. Okay, so let's take maybe a couple of questions and two. Okay, so one from you there, and maybe one from someone at the back. Maybe from the person there, yeah. So one from this side and one from the back.
How do we come to a certain structure of what Ayurveda is about? And what we know is that most of what Ayurveda, whatever little understanding we have, that the text was written when they were in a dhyana. So it came to them. And so where is the point of progress? Because in the Western medicine, it is about research. So when you do, you fail or you succeed and then you move on. So if you can sort of throw some light on this, that what is an evolution of Ayurveda? Is it a certain structure which is being created? And the part two is that all form of alternate medicine, whether it's Tibbeti or Unani or Ayurvedic, isn't it the core the same and it's not different actually one from the other?
So what we'll do is we'll take one more question and then give Aarti just a concluding remark.
Yeah. My question is there scope of research for Ayurvedic products at the molecular or genetic level, considering that the natural substances that are used are so complex chemically? So how do you determine really what is acting on what?
Yeah, I think both of those questions are related, and I think what Darshan would say in the Foundation for Revitalization, where he studies integration and Ayurveda, is that there are two things with Ayurveda. There's the actual formulations, and in the Western sense we think of the medicines and the magic bullet and the active ingredient, but in Ayurveda diagnosis is a big part of it. So there are clinical trials that they have done, there are models that are being developed specifically for systems like Ayurveda, where you don't look at one outcome, but several of them. And there was one for rheumatoid arthritis that was very successful. If you're looking at the genetic and chemical basis, then you're looking at the plant formulations, not any part of the diagnosis. So it's an approach that has to be adapted to the system. Can you study it? You can study the formulations. You can develop it as a system that uses active ingredients in the body in order to heal. But remember, I think these Asian systems of medicine are much more complex, because as I said, it looks at societal, mental, and the system of diagnosis is very much more complex.
So I hope you'll all join me. Sorry, I'm so sorry we didn't keep better track of time for the question and answers. I hope you'll all join me in thanking Aarti for writing this very important book, and I hope will be the beginning of new conversations across the country. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank Aarathi Prasad and Bhrigu Singh for the wonderful session on traditions of healing, travels to Indian medicine. We have Aarathi Prasad at the book signing tent right outside on your right, the green color tent, where she would be available to sign books and maybe a couple of questions. Yeah, maybe a couple of questions because we ran pretty close on our time. Our next session begins at 11:15, which is the pleasures and perfections of Sanskrit. Thank you.